Hi, welcome to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Thanks for joining the conversation. Dr. Mark Cheng is back on the podcast discussing the uniqueness of Asian American culture. He shares stories from his childhood and what it was like being an Asian American while working in Asia. We are both frustrated with the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes and focus in on what actions we can take. I urge everyone to listen and learn as we dissect various self-defense philosophies and tactics. I would also appreciate it if everyone signed my petition on including Asian American history in our education curriculum. I'll link it here. Dr. Mark Cheng is a Chinese medicine practitioner, a lifelong martial artist, and an expert in strength and conditioning. I truly enjoyed this conversation with Mark and hope you do too. If you do, please share this podcast with others and rate it on your platform of choice. You can also take one extra step to show your love by donating to the show on my website, sifumimichan.com, or on patreon.com/sifumimichan. You can donate as little as $1 per month. Every bit helps. Thank you so much for your support. For comments or suggestions, please email me at sifumimichan@gmail.com or reach out on social media at sifumimichan. Now on with the show. Hello, Dr. Mark Cheng. Nice to have you back on the podcast.
Good morning, Sifu. It's good to be back and good to see you again.
Yes. Now, what's interesting is although our last podcast wasn't that long ago, a lot has certainly happened.
For sure.
Yeah. And it's been really great. Actually, since our last conversation here on this show, we've been able to really keep in touch and keep current with things happening. And I'm following you and you're following me. And it's been really great to get to know you, but also kind of see what you've been up to. And one other thing that resonates, of course, is right after the murders in Atlanta, it put a lot of things in perspective of how intense and how the level and gravity of the anti-Asian hate is, not that it wasn't upsetting before, but that was just kind of like a real kick in the stomach. And there's been so much sadness and frustration, and it's continue on. So I just wanted to check in and see how you've been holding up and, you know, what you've been doing to kind of keep yourself grounded and not so angry on a daily basis.
I've been pretty lucky. I mean, I think for myself, I've been so busy that it doesn't allow me time to sort of sit there and just kind of stew in the unfortunate realities of the situation. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that probably kind of got under my skin after Atlanta, and certainly after even the earlier incidents, was hearing people talk about like, oh yeah, everybody loves Asians, this, that, and the other. There's nothing special going on there. Like, no one's bullying the Asians. What are you guys whining about? And like, you know, when you look at it, if there weren't an anti-Asian hate situation going on, or a problem going on, or a trend going on, you wouldn't be hearing a lot of these perpetrators quote that. Now, I think to point the finger solely at white supremacy is a little bit misleading, because the perpetrators of the violence aren't, as far as I know, aren't all white. So that situation, I think, needs a little bit of clarification for us linguistically. We need to be able to be clear about maybe white supremacy is the root of this because it's been pushing down on other minorities, and because those other minorities also feel shafted, feel threatened, feel oppressed. They're taking out their rage on the closest and usually the least likely to retaliate, which oftentimes has historically been Asians, you know, or the elderly. So in that case, yeah, you've got these people who have for years and years not been taught to control their physical rage, not been taught to control their violence. And so now they're acting out. And unfortunately, that kind of thing is definitely on my radar, is definitely weighing on my mind. And certainly as the son of two elderly parents who are staying with me, who are still with me, you know, when they go on their walks, I think about them. I'm like, gosh, you know, I want to be there. But unfortunately, due to the realities of work, you know, like I can't always be there to walk with them. So yeah, there's definitely some things that I think are on my mind that I really wish weren't on my mind if we were in happier times. But these are the things that I think, you know, have been definitely stewing with me for a bit since Atlanta.
Yeah, it certainly has been jarring. And as you know, I've been doing oodles and oodles of news interviews, and I'm getting asked those same questions. Are you worried about your parents, and what is the climate like? And I always kind of move to, we're lucky because we have been in a family of martial arts, and with that comes a certain body awareness. It's not that my parents, who are certainly elderly, I certainly have concern for, but at least with that type of training comes a little bit heightened level of awareness and just kind of hopefully knowledge of oneself. But what's been frustrating has been, like you said, the lack of maybe empathy and understanding from others that want to deny that this is happening, or saying it's just a social media campaign. And I agree with you that it certainly isn't just white supremacy that has caused the attacks, but I think maybe at the root of it, what we're seeing is that propaganda and misinformation, steeping out into the other cultures and other people who maybe are starting to blame, because we all want to blame something, right? The COVID-19, the coronavirus, this pandemic has affected all of us in such a grand scale. It's much easier to have someone to blame versus this virus that we can't actually see and attack, right? And so just seeing that misinformation kind of being perpetuated all the time, which I do believe stems from a lot of the white supremacy, media and whatnot. I think that there's kind of that correlation, but for sure, we understand people's frustration and anger, but it has been just sickening to see, like you said, people who cannot defend themselves being the ones picked on. I think you kind of threw it out there a few times in your post, like, yeah, I'm here. Why didn't you come at me versus my 90-year-old, auntie or grandmother or something like that. And I think we all kind of feel that frustration. I want to jump back into that a little bit later as we talk about like self-awareness and all of that. But I did want to mention that we are talking in May, and we're already in about the second week, which is typically Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Oh, I got it right. It's very long and I always mess it up. But I was curious if that really had any significance for you, or what that was like for you growing up, if you had any knowledge of that month. Because in all honesty, I'm going to admit that I never really did anything special during the month of May, except for the fact that I have a Kung Fu school, and we would sometimes have a performance for some local festival or something like that. But did you ever celebrate it, or was there anything significant for you?
For me, growing up, I was completely oblivious to it, and so I think only as an adult, certainly out here in LA, I grew a little bit more aware of it. And for me, I mean, I think for me personally, I feel like that kind of theme, that AAPI theme, is a daily. I'm so blessed to be surrounded by so many really super talented and very inspiring Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. As you know, one of the deepest influences on me is Guru Sifu Dan Inosanto, as a Filipino American, and so he's as a Pacific Islander Asian American. What greater influence could you have? I have friends who are practitioners of Hawaiian Kenpo, and who are Polynesians. So I get to see what they do, as far as around the martial spectrum, and certainly in the healing spectrum with manual medicine such as Lomi and other healing arts, Hilot from the Philippines, and certainly Tuena and all these different healing arts, or Seifuku from Japan. I've been lucky to see all of these different kinds of riffs on a theme. So whether it's martial arts or healing arts, or restorative arts, to be able to see how different people play, and how different people approach a particular problem set to restore. That's for me, that kind of AAPI, I don't want to say glorification, but celebration, is really kind of like a 365 day or 365 kind of theme.
Yeah, I get that. And it's interesting because I feel like because of all of the anti-Asian hate, this year, the month is very, very, very much more in the public eye and much more celebrated and much more significant. There are like daily events. There's just things happening all the time. And you and I have also spoken a lot about the show Warrior since my interview with the lovely Perry Young. And Perry and I discussed the parallels between the issues happening today and the 1800s, which just seems like historically, oh, that was way back then. Things like that don't happen now. And one of the things that resonated was that Asian American experience, that trying to find a place of belonging and not quite feeling Chinese if you're from China, or Japanese if you're from Japan, but like also not feeling American being in America because you don't look like quote unquote everyone else, or that sense of where do you fit in? Did you ever feel like that growing up?
Oh, sure. I mean, I was raised in kind of semi-rural Delaware, in Dover, Delaware. So like growing up at the time in the early 70s, I mean, it was just right after the civil rights movement of the 60s. So growing up, I heard the N-word plenty of times from neighbors, from kids in school, from, I mean, all sorts of things like that. And to be called chink, gook, slant, things like that. I mean, like I've heard all of that growing up. And to see it coming back now, I remember like not that long ago, maybe like a week or two ago, I had a conversation with the son of a friend of mine who was in college and an Asian American young man. And he was struggling because where he was going to school in a more rural part of the country, outside of the campus, he was hearing quite a lot of these epithets and hearing stuff like that and thrown at him. And he's the sweetest, most chill, down to earth. Like there's nothing confrontational or belligerent or obnoxious about him at all. I mean, and I've seen this kid a lot of times. So for him to be targeted with stuff like that, just purely on the basis of skin, not because of behavior, not because of anything else, is kind of like, really, are we still there, America? And the answer is definitely a resounding yes. So what Perry had to say is spot on. And also, as a hat tip to his castmate, Jason Tobin, Jason made a comment that I thought was spot on as well. He said, I love the fact that Warrior's been renewed, or something along the lines that he loved the fact that Warrior had been renewed for another season. But he was kind of like saying that it's sort of a shame that it's happening under circumstances like it is now. And yes, it's great to have a show that speaks to all of us as Asian Americans, and certainly as mixed blood Asian Americans, to have something to rally around, to have something to be inspired by, to have something like make you feel like there's a way of fighting for something, and that your struggle is not totally like foreign to everyone else. But these are things that certainly for me, I thought we'd left behind left behind for the most part in the late 70s, early 80s. So to see it coming back in the form that was very familiar to me as a kid is definitely a little bit unnerving.
Yeah. And so now I know you as a full adult, very confident in one's skin, very knowledgeable, very worldly. And so what was kind of that like for you in your younger years, and where you're saying you heard all of these racial slurs? How did you handle that? Because I'm curious as to the parallel of how kids of this generation are handling it. So what was that like for you? Were you just always kind of very, tough skin? Did you just laugh it off? Was it very hurtful? What was that experience for you?
I don't think I really processed it that well. When I say processed it that well, I don't mean like it totally messed me up and made me go run to my room and cry every night. It wasn't that. It's just more like it confused me. Like, why are they saying these things? Like, I don't get it. And it was almost like part of the vernacular a lot of times. And it's very interesting because a lot of the people that would speak that way back then don't really do it now. But I think it was just part of the culture back then. And so I remember hearing that as a kid. I was like, oh, I came home. I remember one time I asked my dad, what does gook mean? And my dad is like, he's like jaw dropped.
Yeah.
He's like, oh my God. And so when he explained it to me that it was an anti-Asian slur, I was like, oh, that's odd.
That's not nice.
Yeah, I just remember as a kid kind of being like, what did I do? And so that kind of thing, I think, often played into my head as a kid growing up. Like, did I do anything? Because if I was acting a fool, we all know that if you act a fool, you draw negative attention, right? Now, and I think there's a line of responsibility that needs to be borne there. If you're acting a fool, if you're being obnoxious, if you're being a pest, if you're being a menace to society, then you draw some kind of negative reaction from people. But for that to be a racial reaction is a little bit different. I think that's something that people need to be responsible for as well. So as a kid growing up, I remember hearing a lot of those words and just being like baffled more than anything else. Like, why is this coming out?
Yeah, I agree. And that's what's really been interesting to me, because I wonder if it's like you and I are discussing now, we just heard it and didn't really take it as a personal attack in the way that we see. For example, you were talking about discussing with a friend and how difficult that was for them. And I wonder if it's been inflamed because they see the correlation of, well, we're saying this to you, but that could lead to an old woman on the street getting hit over the head. And like, they see this violence and they see what it really means. Like, we hate you because you look like you do, or you come from where you do, or your background is that. I think when we were younger, you and I, Oscar and I, my husband, we were watching Minari, and in this film, it's like two young kids and they're just hanging out. And the kid's like, oh, why is your face so flat? And the kid didn't go home and like cry over it or be so upset because this kid said this. And a lot of times the kid doesn't even really know they're being racially incorrect or whatever. And I turned to Oscar and I'm like, oh my God, I remember in second grade, a kid turned to me and said the exact same thing. Right. And I didn't go home and cry, like you said, but thinking about it now, if someone were to start just like kind of attacking you for how you look, how you are because of your culture, I think we would take it differently because we're a little more educated on what that means, but it's also the context. But I do wonder, how will this generation cope with that? Because you happen to be there as a uncle figure to your friend. So you knew about this and you could help with that. How many kids are going through this and don't know how to process it, don't have someone to talk to, and then are taking it in the way where they can see in the media what that really means? Because I think it's that ignorance is bliss thing, right? Like, you and I are a little bit like, well, these people said these things. It wasn't very nice, but I don't know. We didn't take it in the same gravity. And I wonder, is that going to be more damaging for this generation then?
I think you've got a very, very legit point there. A friend of mine, Peter Crone, has a line that I think is very telling and very apropos here. And he says, words are the wardrobe of the soul. So I'm going to repeat that again. Words are the wardrobe of the soul. So when you listen to how people speak, when you listen to their language, when there's hate in there and then they play it off, that's telling you two things. There's both hatred, which we all know is born of ignorance, but also cowardice, because they're trying to play it off. They're trying to not be called out. They're not trying to face it. So I think, it's one thing to be careless with your words and go, well, I didn't really mean anything by that. Yeah, okay, that's cute. But the thing is that your speech then informs other people, and it hits triggers in their subconscious. And some of those people will act out based on that. Now, I know that there's certain people who will go, well, I have free speech and I can say whatever I want, and how they act is on them. Great. So if you're putting that out karmically, understand that those kind of things will come back around, and they will inflict a lot of pain. You may not have to believe in karma, but you certainly can't deny cause and effect. Mm-hmm. So to see that there are people out there being so callous, not just careless, but callous with their speech, and not understanding like the triggers that they pull when it comes to people that are predisposed to act out violently, people who have less control, people who have issues, people who are closer to, let's say, more vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, such as children, such as whoever, right? Or even such as adults who are untrained or unable to respond in a physical sense. When you trigger individuals like that who are willing to prey on these other populations, you are also responsible. So in the hate speech, in the speech that like people go like, it's just a word. I'm not hating on anybody. You're not admitting you're hating on anybody. You're not admitting, you're not facing, you're not owning the responsibility of what's behind the words that you choose. And I think that's an important, like, come to Jesus moment for a lot of America to have.
Absolutely. I think that you have something there is that I've been talking to a lot of my youth about as well, where they say, well, my friend didn't mean anything by this, or they're my friend. And so because they're my friend, it couldn't be a racial attack, right? It couldn't be harassment. Like, I'm trying to define that with these kids. I've been asking a lot of questions from my teens and my youth. Have you ever had an encounter where someone has said something because of, your background or anything? And I was surprised at how it's weird that I was surprised, because I know it's happening. Of course it happens. It happens in every generation. It's how they handle it. And I was surprised at how much it was happening and to what scale it was happening amongst friends. And I said, like you said, ha ha ha, I didn't mean anything, but it is our responsibility to correct that, because like you just said, that can escalate into them then acting out and thinking it's okay, and get in that continuous path, right? And so I was really surprised to hear, like, a high schooler, and how often their quote unquote friends were saying things like, oh, well, don't you eat dog at home? And don't, and just all of this like constant stereotypical things. And I said, do you ever correct it? I asked, and they're like, no, I never really say anything. I just let it be. And I go, okay, well, you don't have to get in a fight or an argument, but there's definitely room for you there to correct that, because they may say that to you and you may take it one way, but they may go to say that to someone else, and that could escalate into something completely different. And it also reinforces the idea that that is okay when it's not.
Right. I think context is king there. And it's kind of tough because, like, let's say one of my best friends, Dr. Jim Yuan, right, who's another Chinese American guy. Like, if we're joking back and forth, like throwing, Asian Americans under the bus because we're talking about, these are the things that we struggle with our own people.
Right.
It's one thing. If we're in racially mixed company and everyone else is kind of throwing banter back and forth, and it's banter and you can tell by the vibe,
right?
That's one thing, because they're kind of owning it, and they're also there's a give and take, because we're like, there's reciprocal teasing. But to see how those individuals act that tease that way outside of the context of such like a closed room, and see how they treat people in public, I think that's important, because like some of the people that we write permission slips for are also the same people that don't know how to contextualize their speech, or don't know how to contextualize their behavior, and will say things with a different spirit. Like, a lot of times we can use for example, like the N-word. African Americans, like that, among African Americans, to use that oftentimes is a term of endearment.
Yeah, it's part of the lexicon. And
totally.
Yeah.
But for someone that's not African American to use that, ultra condescending and dehumanizing. So, like, the context is clutch there to be able to hear a word and say, like, okay, we can't use that word. No one can use that word. That for me makes me feel a little bit uneasy. But to say we have to understand who's using what word in what context, that to me is more sensible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a hopefully a common understanding or knowledge of, okay, these are my friends and this is why they're saying it, or if they are being stereotypical and they are kind of bashing my culture, right? Like, I think that there should be a pretty good gauge, and that's just knowing yourself, knowing your friends as well, knowing who you're around and everything like that. But I wanted to kind of dive back into that whole feeling of belonging, because I see these kids and I wonder, how do they feel in their sense of belonging? Because of course, me growing up, I was very aware of being Asian, being that there was only like 2 other Asians and they were both Filipino at my school. I went to a private school, and it was a very obvious thing for me that I knew that I looked different and I ate different lunches and I had a different experience. And then I've also been to China, and where I certainly was not accepted as Chinese. People, even though I looked Chinese, they knew I was not Chinese from mainland China. Like, that was very obvious. And so it's really interesting too, because there are stereotypes that do, like, check out amongst Asians. And I think it's kind of one of those things where like Oscar will say, well, I can make fun of Spanish people because I'm Spanish, I'm Hispanic, but you can make fun of Asian people because you're in that culture. But well, I know that you've spent some time in Asia and China and different places. Did you have a similar experience like that, where even though it's kind of coming home to the quote unquote motherland or the roots and whatnot, it's a very different country than America, obviously. But what was that like for you? I think you worked there as well.
Oh, sure. I mean, on a variety of levels, it was like that. I mean, as a little kid, I remember when my mom went back to Taiwan to visit her parents. She took me to an amusement park, and like there were some like a cart thing that was self-powered, like you step on a pedal and it would propel you around. And I'd never seen that before. And like I think it might have been my first time to an amusement park. I think I was like 4 at the time or something like that. So pretty little. And at the time I'd grown up only hearing, I mean, like as far as speaking, only speaking English. Like I'd heard my parents speak Chinese, but as far as like to me, only English. And so like when I went to Taiwan with my mom, I remember like we went to this amusement park, and she had me go in with kids, and like I got on the thing and I couldn't figure out how to make it work. And then like the attendant came up to me and was talking to me, and I didn't understand what he was saying. And then he was like looking at me, and I was just kind of staring at him like blankly. And then he put my hands on the thing, and he grabbed my leg and put it like boop on the pedal, and he just looked so annoyed. And then I remember my mom told me years later, because I remember that incident, but I couldn't remember the entire like backstory behind it. And evidently that attendant was like, my mom talked to the attendant, asked like what was going on. And the attendant at the time was so shocked that I couldn't speak Mandarin or Taiwanese.
Yeah.
Being a full-blooded, Chinese American, full-blooded Chinese. And he was like, what's wrong with him? Is he retarded or something like that? And he sincerely meant that. And she was like so shocked and so hurt. And that was like when I was little. So fast forward a few decades. And being in Asia working and doing research. So like, as far as places I frequented, Korea and mainland China are the two big ones. I've only been to Taiwan, I think maybe a couple of other times, just for very short stints, usually for martial arts stuff. But mainland China was interesting. I remember the first time I went there to work in Beijing, the host there was like, oh, do you speak Chinese? I go, oh, a little bit. And I'm just trying to totally play it off. And he's like, oh, do you drink? I go, yeah, I enjoy drinking, but like not tonight, like I'm a little bit jet lagged. And, tomorrow I have my, first day of having to teach. I was there to teach for FMS. And so I was like, okay, I want to represent the screen and represent Gray and represent my teachers as best I can. I want to be on point, be well rested, the whole 9 yards. And he goes, okay, well, let's just go out to dinner. And so we went out to dinner, and he's like, oh, so what do you like to drink when you're back in America? And I go, I'm kind of fond of vodka. He goes, oh, okay. And so like he whips out his phone, and he's like talking to me, and I don't see what he's texting. Later on, he's a little bit careless and leaves his phone on there and figures that I can't read Chinese. And so it said he was texting his assistant to bring by 3 bottles of vodka. I'm like, this is going to get interesting. And so like during the
drinking game,
we'll get to that. So he's talking kind of real subtle crap the whole time. Like, oh, have you ever had baijiu, like Chinese stronger liquor? And I'm like, yeah, I've had it before in a previous visit. When I came like in the 90s. He goes, oh, did you like it? I go, it's okay. It's just not my preferred drink. Mm-hmm. He goes, yeah, you Chinese Americans, a little bit weaker. You don't really. So he just kept on throwing in things like that. So it's
yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm just letting it slide and kind of grinning. And then his assistant shows up with the 3 bottles, and he goes, yeah, it's a pity, we have this good vodka here. But since you Chinese Americans probably don't know how to, hold your liquor like real Chinese. And I'm like, oh, okay. And he goes, well, maybe you can have just a little bit. I go, oh, okay. So, well, I played the 3 refusals game, and then, so we're drinking. And I'm like, man, I really didn't want to do this, but I think I'm going to have to put a hurt on this guy. And so, like, I'm drinking pretty much straight vodka, very little ice, just, ganbei. Literally, for those of you guys that don't know what ganbei means, your listeners, gan meaning dry, bei meaning beis, the cup, right? So when you say ganbei, it's like one shot, right? People equate it to cheers.
Yeah.
People equate it to saying cheers, but it's really like shoot it, drain the glass.
Done. Yeah.
So I'm like, gan, draining it. And then like this guy's like turning red. And he's a bigger guy than me. And he had us seated in this place where like you have to have some relatively deft footwork to be able to get around the table to get the restroom. And so like I kind of walked around that, wasn't wobbling, wasn't holding the table, nothing. Calmly went there, calmly came back. And this guy's getting redder and redder, and I'm just drinking with him to the point where like I'm trying to accelerate the drinking because I want him to feel this the next day. Mm-hmm. And so then he apologized. And then after he apologized for saying like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Like, you can clearly hold your liquor. I'm sorry for calling you out. And then I started speaking to him in Chinese, and then he got even more embarrassed. So yeah, as far as people who pass judgment on you because you don't look like them or you don't fit in like them. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that. I mean, like both over there in China and Taiwan, certainly in Korea. In Korea is interesting. Koreans are like, if you're not Korean, but you make the effort to speak Korean, they give you a lot of props. Mm-hmm. So I'm, to my Korean friends and family, like I have a lot of affection for them, a lot of good feeling over there and good memories in Korea. But at the same time too, they're like, yeah, you're not Korean, you're not this, you're not that. So like, there's a little bit of exclusion, but it kind of makes sense because like ethnically I'm not. Mm-hmm. But certainly here in the States, there's a kind of, you're not white, which is no kidding, dude. Like, but at the same time too, the American populace is such a melting pot these days. I mean, it's been great in the last, I would say 10 years to be able to turn on the TV and see shows like everything from, I don't know, look at NCIS, right? Like any of those shows where like you have a black lead, you have minority leads, you have, I can't remember the name of the woman, I think who was on NCIS or CSI. There was a Brazilian who was playing opposite LL Cool J, mm-hmm. A Brazilian woman. So I, to be able to see these different ethnicities on the screen, I love it. To have shows like Warrior, which is so exciting, such a thrill to see. Marco Polo, which was written by our friend John Fusco. Mm-hmm. I so thoroughly enjoyed Marco Polo because it helped. It helped the audience understand that Asians are more than, like, especially Asians from that time period in the Khans, for example, are more than just these random savages that went around, raping and pillaging and beheading and doing things like that. But rather, these were people that had a very distinct culture, very distinct ways, very distinct logic, and very empathizable ethics mm-hmm. and morals and values. So we're very lucky in a lot of ways over here, I gotta say.
Just as a sidebar for anybody super interested in the Khans or the Genghis Khan history, I highly recommend Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, which just makes it unbelievably fascinating. And you just learn so much. And he's amazing at his retelling of history. So that is highly recommended if you haven't heard it yet and you have an interest, because it's like way up there. My husband Oscar's listened to it like 5 or 6 times. He's like super obsessed. But it's what kind of resonated with me there during you retelling and sharing your stories was also that I think we're still not even 100% there yet in America, where they realize how different each Asian culture is. Like they're vastly different. And like you said, there's not even an acceptance like, oh, well, you're also a fellow Asian. Like we're so finally coming to, I think this year, really wanting to unite more, but like each Asian culture speaks different languages. And so what unites people is language. That's one of the big things. If we can communicate, then we're on the same page. But all of these Asian cultures speak different languages. So one of the issues that we were having, because as you know, I have been partnering with law enforcement to try to get more Asians to report crimes, to let them know when things are happening, but they're afraid to call because it's like, oh, they don't speak my language. And it's like, you push 1 for Spanish or 2 for English. And it's like, yes, there's a lot of different Spanish speaking countries, a lot of different cultures there, but they all speak the same language. So the challenge between the Asian culture is like all different languages. And also there are a lot of different, there are some similarities, of course, in respect and, even some of the foods, there's little influences, but I mean, they're radically different cultures, and the acceptance amongst each culture is not equal for sure, so
totally.
I do love though your drinking story. I spent time in China as well, but I did not have a drinking challenge by any means, and I'm very glad.
That was so unintentional.
And I'm very glad, because those who are listening, that baijiu stuff, it's like diesel gasoline is what I would refer it to. And you play this drinking game and it's not any fun at all. And I've seen many people lose that probably like years off their liver from it. But it is interesting. I was curious if you got picked on because you were Chinese American more than like, say, a white American or a different, another American that was maybe with you. Did you notice like they kind of hone in a little more on you because you look Chinese also? Do you feel that at all?
I don't know if it's just because I look Chinese, but I was also one of the smaller kids, in my grade growing up. So
I meant over in China.
Oh, in China.
Like when you were in China, was it like, oh, you're the Chinese American? Like we were like kind of picking on you and poking you a little more, but maybe they weren't as aggressive with like just the other Americans that weren't Chinese. Cause there's like this little expectation, like a slight, like you should know better, but you don't. Like, that's what I get when I'm there. Right. Like how I didn't feel.
To my recollection, I don't think I've traveled to mainland China with anyone else. So the times I've been to, the times I've been to mainland China to work, it was just me flying solo.
You were just there to teach.
Just there to teach. And luckily I've had translators and stuff like that, especially when I'm like, if I have to teach at a higher level, like I can't do it in Chinese. My Chinese, but just daily conversation in Mandarin, 普通话, no problem. I can get around. But it's funny because like you mentioned, the variation in languages and certainly the variation in dialects. What a lot of people don't realize is that when you look at Asians, like let's say any Asian country now, right? These countries were made out of different tribes and different ethnic groups, like literally different ethnic groups that were like united by force. So let's say China, for example, right? A lot of people think, oh yeah, Chinese people live in China. Okay, what are Chinese people? So let's look at this flag behind me.
Yeah.
The first time I saw this 5-colored flag, I was like kind of baffled. No idea what it was. And the place I saw it in was the Insano Academy. Now, for those people that have never been to the Insano Academy or never heard of it, it's sort of like a mecca of martial arts, like international martial arts. You'll see martial arts taught there from France, from different parts of China, from Malaysia, from Indonesia, India, African martial arts, Japanese martial arts, Brazilian martial arts. So like it runs the gamut. So on the rafters of the ceilings in the Insano Academy, you'll see flags for every one of the styles that's represented there and taught in the curriculum. And I saw this flag and I had no idea what it was. And so my master, Guru Dan Insano, said, Doc, do you know what that is? I go, sir, I recognize every other flag on these rafters. I don't know what that one is at all. He goes, well, let me tell you. I was like, please do, sir. When he was setting up the academy, he wanted to have flags to represent and pay respect to the place of origin of every single one of the arts that he taught as part of the curriculum, or that was being taught there as part of the curriculum, even if he himself wasn't teaching. And so when it came time to find a flag to pay respect to Chinese martial arts because of the Chen, Qi, Qun, Dao, Jun Fan, Gong Fu, and any of the other styles that fit in, he was kind of struggling because it's like, if I put the Taiwan flag, people from mainland China will feel slighted. And, if I put the mainland Chinese flag, everyone that's in expat Chinese communities or non-mainland Chinese communist communities will feel like upset. So, the people from Taiwan, Hong Kong, other places, Singaporeans will feel upset because it's like, they'll say that doesn't represent Chinese people as a whole. And he goes, so I did some research and I found that one of the last flags that unified China was this 5-colored flag. And so I did some research on it. And so he goes, Doc, I invite you to do a little bit of research yourself and find out what it stands for. This 五四国旗, like 5-colored flag, actually is very interesting. Each of the colors not only represents, the 5 colors of like the 5 elements, but also represents, actually, it's not quite the 5 elements because it's missing green. And blue and black would be both for water in terms of the 5 elements. But in terms of like the ethnic and cultural influences in China, I thought this is very, very telling. The red stands for the Han Chinese, the ethnic majority of Chinese. Yellow stands for Manchurians. Blue stands for Mongols. So Han, Man, Meng, Hui, Zhang. The Hui Muslims are represented by white. And the Hui people are often referred to as like, they're referred to important parts of their culture as qingzhen, pure and true. So that white stands for the purity. Black for the Tibetans, so zangzu. So, even by virtue of that flag as symbolic of uniting a nation, that nation state is made up of 5 major ethnic groups, never mind all the other sub-ethnic groups. So like, I think that's an important thing for people who look at China or look at some of the other countries or other nationalities to realize, like, a nationality and ethnicity can be 2 totally different things. So even like in the Philippines, like among the Chinese, these different groups, like Han Chinese, even among the Han Chinese, there's so many different linguistic barriers.
Oh my goodness!
Right, between Cantonese, like 5 different major types of Cantonese, never mind Mandarin and everything else. In the Philippines, from island to island in the archipelago, you may have what sounds like almost a totally different language. Like the Tagalogs speak a different language from the Visayans, who speak a different tongue from like the Moro people in the Mindanao. So like everything that you hear is going to be very different, and in these different locales, there's a different culture. So to view them monolithically is like you're intentionally missing out on the truth. So for us, I think, especially in today's world, like since we have so much access to information, why choose to be myopic?
Yeah, I'm all with you there, and this is why one of my big things was I want to be more educated, and I didn't get that education, of course, when I was growing up here in America, and just even the Asian American history. And that's why I put a petition out. It's been a real passion of mine, but I'm with you. I think one of the big things for AAPI Heritage that we can all do is just like kind of step outside that comfort zone and learn something new, learn something about another culture. And a really cool way is to talk to someone from that culture, and they may not even know, and it'll help them learn more about their culture. So I just think like these conversations are super important. And I mean, naturally, I always gravitate to food. Like we could just talk about the foods we all love from all these cultures, and that like brings us all together. Because that's one of the most, universal things we all want to do is like eat something delicious. And I think there is a little bit more of a respect for food, even versus someone's tradition, because, it's food.
Totally. I mean, I think that's why the late Anthony Bourdain is so missed. Like he was one of these guys that could travel anywhere in the world. And like he would look at, I can't remember exactly what it was. He said there were 3 questions that he asked everywhere he went. Like, what's important to you? How do you eat? And then what makes you happy? Or what's the message that you want to send out to the rest of the world? And so like, those 3 things I think unify so much in terms of our food, in terms of like our priorities. And so like, no matter where he went, he found that there were kind of riffs on a theme. Like everyone was saying kind of the same thing, no matter where he went.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, as a fitness professional, really all clients want the same thing, right? They want to look good, they want to feel good, they want to be with their families, they want to be happy. Like we're all kind of seeking the same things as humans. And it's frustrating that we can't all just see that and then have a happy way to get there, that we have to be so angry and we have to be so, there has to be so much dissonance between cultures. And instead of feeling excited and embracing one another, we feel threatened, right? Because I think that's a big part of the dynamic here in the anti-Asian is one, they're blaming Asians on the coronavirus and everything. But beyond that, the minority myth, like it's their, maybe taking your jobs or their, success means your failure, where that doesn't necessarily mean that, right? Just because somebody else is successful doesn't mean you're going to be a failure. But I think our mindset is of that competitive or supply, right? There's not enough for everybody. There's not enough for me. So if you're taking it, then that means there won't be enough money to be made or whatever, greedy we're conceptualizing.
Totally. I think that scarcity mindset, that feeling of like, I'm not going to have enough, that feeling of like insecurity of resources, of safety, of, safety being health, or safety being like being wanted, like simply being wanted by someone else, right? Like, oh, that guy's going to take my job, or that guy's going to take my money, or that guy's going to take my resources, or that guy's going to buy out my building or whatever, right? Like there are all of these like what if insecurities that come into play that oftentimes don't really have a basis in reality.
Yeah.
Which is, it's interesting how people who feel threatened, who feel insecure will act. You corner an animal and you watch how it acts. And a lot of times people just in their own minds make up these constructs so that they feel cornered and then they act out on that. I think a lot of the funny things about that in terms of race is that like if people were to actually watch what's going on, no one's taking your jobs. Maybe the people who are power players above you, who are white, who are rich, are actually giving your jobs to someone else. So the people that you want to be holding accountable aren't the people that are actually working in customer service or working in sanitation or working in whatever, but maybe the people that, decided that they would hire those other people instead. Mm-hmm. And then maybe also too, like this is a line that I heard from my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu teacher, Roy Harris. He said, if you look at like when you're pointing a finger, the finger that's pointing is going one way, but there are three more pointing back at you. So like, if you're worried that someone else is taking jobs, well, how many people of your particular ethnic group do you see in this particular line of work that, for example, is taken over by whoever, right? So if it's taken over by whomever, like, how come you're not going for those kind of jobs? And how many of people of your ethnic demographic want those kinds of jobs? And if the answers aren't like 360 congruent, then maybe you should ask your own self that question, like, why are you poking and making accusations about that?
Mm-hmm. I agree. And what's been interesting is that a lot of people have asked me because there's frustration. Like I live in Orlando and we have kind of a nice little metropolis bubble here of what I consider people who are a little more like-minded. And as you come outside of that, we find like the dissonance between those who voted for 45 and like completely bought into the narrative. And I completely disagree with that. Obviously, everybody who is listening probably knows that, and who didn't agree has already tuned out anyway. But they've asked me, like, why would an immigrant or why would somebody of a BIPOC community want to vote against their better interests? And I'm like, it's that fear that has been instilled of the scarcity. It's that fear of like, well, I'm already here as an immigrant, but if more immigrants come in, and because people just couldn't understand how they would vote against their better interest or against the better interest of their people, right? Like this is our community and we should be like lifting each other up. And if we actually did that, we would find that the world would be a better place, but it's just like not the reality we live in, unfortunately.
I think some ethnic groups also have been acculturated to, if you're a equating good person with mm-hmm. patriotism / nationalism. So it's like, if you're a good person, you're that kind of person who is super vocal about endorsing the government, endorsing like law enforcement, endorsing the military, endorsing the people who like are the hegemony makers.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways I get that, like if you're a new person in the country, you want to show gratitude for all the freedoms that you have. But on the other hand too, right? Like if your whole personal identity, your whole sense of self-worth is tied into how loud of a cheerleader you can be for the government that rules over the place that you're in, what if that government that's ruling over the place that you're in is not making the most ethical of decisions? And so you've decided that as a good fill in the blank, you are going to, no matter what, post a picture of that president on your wall, post a picture of that leader on your wall, like stand behind them, support them, come hell or high water. I think those come hell or high water, like endorsements, or like I'll stand by them no matter what. Those themes are something that we also see in people who have been chronically abused.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an important consideration for some folks to make, and introspection as well. Like, okay, you stand behind these people, but like, are they really people that are lifting you up, are bringing out the best in you, and that you are able to contribute to in some meaningful way? Or are you just someone that they tolerate? And if it's the second, why are you standing for that? Why are you satisfied? And I think that's an important conversation, important internal dialogue a lot of us need to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation with a lot of the misinformation as well, because I think the people that I consider to be pretty evil are really good at playing into the fears on us as humans. And so a lot of those immigrants, or a lot of those people who come from communist countries, they love to throw the word socialism out because it immediately makes them so afraid of what they escaped and what they tried to come here to America for, which is everything anti the horrors that they went through. And so that misinformation and that propaganda, they're just so good at making you feel afraid. And again, emphasizing that scarcity, right? But like, I think it's just being able to utilize the media to, manipulate people and how they think. And it's just a lot of work. It's a lot of work to go and research and find the right information. I'm sure even as a doctor, you show up somewhere and they're like, well, I WebMD'd my issue and here's what I know and blah, 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 blah. And you're just like, okay, yes, there's information on the internet, but it's so hard to really find the right and the factual information, because anybody can write an article and then it could be, oh, I read this on the internet, so it's true. And that seems so unbelievable, but we all know somebody that we've had a conversation with where we've had to deal with that.
Totally. I mean, the reductionism is staggering. And I think, we in the States have a tendency, I shouldn't say we in the States, now that I think about it more, like as I'm thinking back on social media posts, globally, there's a tendency towards reductionist thinking, like very myopic, very, very like binary. So it's like, it's either black or it's white. And it's like, no, it isn't. Like even something like lower back pain. Gray Cook uses this example all the time. He's like, lower back pain. What could cause lower back pain? And it's like, well, contact injury. You fell and you fractured a vertebrae. Okay, that'll cause lower back pain. You lifted something wrong, right? You created a local strain. Okay, that could cause lower back pain. You have a dysfunction in your hip and something up there, around your back is overcompensating. Yep, that can cause lower back pain. You have, I don't know, some sort of like disc bulge. Like there's a structural abnormality there that could cause lower back pain. You have metastatic prostate cancer. That'll cause lower back pain, or can cause lower back pain. So it's like, how do you differentiate? You have to be able to widen your view and take in more information. But if you apply a one size fits all, like what drives me bananas is when I see, like, to your point, as a medical professional, to see people saying like, oh, I check out the number one thing for back pain. Like, oh my God. Or shoulder pain, or whatever, you fill in the blank, whatever, right? You do this exercise, it'll fix your, like, there's nothing that is truly that simple. And it's not, I don't say that to intimidate people. I don't say that to belittle, But I'm saying that because like I want people to be able to think in a little bit of a wider lens to take in more information. So like as much as we want to simplify and say like, oh yeah, Asians are this way, like situations are this way, people are this way, like there's a yes and no. And we need to be able to contextualize more completely so that we don't accidentally write off people that are good. Like don't embrace people that are doing something as bad. And then also too, like even within the bad, there are moments when they will do things that are good and logical. Like there are some things that 45 did. I'm struggling to think of one right now, but I'm sure there are things that he did legislatively that make sense.
Right.
There have been other things that are sort of like, are you freaking kidding? And same thing with every other leader throughout history.
Exactly.
The thing is that how we communicate and the honesty, transparency, and respect that we are able to communicate with is clutch. So when we communicate in a way that's precise, that's responsible, that allows people to not only hear what we're saying, but to understand it and then like build on that and be enlightened by it and lift up. I think that's what we need to have in a leader. We need to be able to communicate in such a way where we're raising the level of the playing field.
Yeah. And as you know, like recently I've been just harping on that whole education bit. And maybe that's like the teacher side in me. So one, yes, we need Asian American history in schools so the kids can learn about this. Kind of going back to all the anti-Asian hate that's happening now, wrapping up that AAPI month. Like I also conducted harassment and bystander intervention training, which is super tricky. So originally I wanted the law enforcement to do it. And then there was all these legalities with them giving specific advice to citizens. And even though them as people were like, I'd love to, but my hands are kind of tied because of XYZ. And I kind of came to this understanding reality of how all this works. So they were able to like partner with me and give a safety presentation on awareness and, what to do in terms of trying to keep yourself safe, what to do in like actor shootive, for schools and things like that. So that was all like, okay. So then I took it upon myself to go, all right, well, I already promised this, so let's just go for it. And I've learned so much about myself, but also as a teacher, like, okay, what lines do we want to draw here? Because you're an expert in self-defense, you do K-3 combat, you have extensive martial arts training. And it's like, I'm sure you've been asked this question by so many students and people, like, what's the technique that's going to work? How can I defend myself? And I hate that. I hate the question when people come in and ask about self-defense, because I wish I looked and sounded like my dad, because he could say something very like philosophical, like, self-defense is prevention, or in Chinese, it always sounds better, like self-defense is self-awareness. And, but, for me to say it, it never sounds as good as when my dad says stuff and just kind of says, look, fighting's not necessarily the answer. Right. But of course, having that knowledge is great, and then addressing the, every action has a consequence as well. So what do you tell people? Because I'm sure you get asked this question, especially now where people are thinking, I need to defend myself, or what can we do?
To speak to part of what your experience was as far as the difficulty for law enforcement to be able to chime in, the law is so variable from locale to locale, for each municipality, each state, county. So what's legal in one might not be in another. And so to give advice that can say like, you can do X, Y, and Z, especially when it comes to force on force kind of encounters. Like, look at the police, even though sometimes they may be following their procedures, they're still subject to all of these different potential liabilities in terms of the law. So for us as civilians, certainly it's going to be spicy. I think what I would encourage everyone to do, if they haven't already, is regardless of gender, regardless of age, regardless of field of endeavor, regardless of your athletic ability, at the very least, try a self-defense workshop, because it's going to whet your appetite and expose you to what some of the possibilities are. And especially if you're someone who abhors violence, it's really good to understand it. Like what you abhor, if you remain ignorant to it, it's always going to have power over you. Always. And so like, if you're ever, God forbid, you're ever faced with a situation where you have to physically defend yourself, your abhorrence to violence has now made you completely and totally helpless. You're now unaware of choices. And in moments when you feel like you can't flee and instead you freeze because that happens to be your nervous system reaction, you've utterly disempowered yourself. So please, like, expose yourself to the mechanics of self-defense, of martial arts. I'm not saying you need to go run out and sign a year's contract at your local martial arts school or whatever, right? But definitely do explore. And there's something that's important about martial arts. There's something that's important about being able to control our bodies, to understand our bodies, but also to understand like the potential of physical threat. I think that's a reality that a lot of us are finally waking up to. And you and your father, I think, made a point about this in the documentary. And for those of you guys that haven't, shameless plug, for those of you guys that haven't seen Mimi's documentary on her father, it's out on Amazon Prime. Please check it out. Certainly as a Chinese American and whose parents are of that same age as Cheng, I think you guys really need to go see it. For myself, though, like, I remember growing up hearing from my dad, like, hey, why are you so into martial arts? Martial arts is something that, like, thugs do or gangsters do, or like, you want to be a troublemaker? What's your attraction to martial arts? And then when he realized that I'm into it, just like, as the phrase goes, for the culture, and taking the knowledge that I've learned from martial arts and using it towards like health and fitness and things like that and rehab, his attitudes have definitely changed. But I think for your listeners and your viewers who are not experienced in martial arts, I think understanding the mechanics of physical violence and the logic behind it also has a lot of carryovers into sport, because you will understand positioning, you will understand 360 awareness. And it's not to say that you have to be ultra vigilant to the point of paranoia and stress. It's not that. The ability to become aware allows you to diffuse situations earlier before they get to the point where like you have to fight. The ability to fight, additionally, like knowing that you know how to fight, allows you to carry yourself in a different way. Not as in a braggadocious kind of like confrontational, yeah, bring it on kind of way, but rather like, I know I can fight. I also know the consequences of what happened when I fight. So like, I could lose or the other person could lose. Either way, someone loses. And that loss may be multifactorial, meaning like, not only did maybe, let's say, I get stabbed or someone else get injured, but then there are legal responsibilities on top of that. So I think when you're more aware of all of these different factors that come into play, you're able to diffuse and feel more confident in being able to walk away, rather than feeling like, well, my manhood is threatened, my sovereignty is threatened, my identity is threatened. Like, F it. Like, someone who looks like their trouble is coming towards you on the street, take a different route, cross the street, whatever, diffuse it if you can. On the other hand, if they chase you and they corner you,
right.
If you don't have physical options, you're kind of left at their mercy, or left at the mercy of bystanders, hoping that there are bystanders who are willing to intervene on your behalf. Mm-hmm. But if you have options, if you have that kind of training, if you have that kind of practice and that confidence, then it's sort of like, it just becomes like math. Like, for someone that doesn't understand mathematics, to hit them like with a question of 2x plus 7 equals 15, solve for x. Like, if they've never seen that before, they're going to be like, lost, total deer in the headlights. But to someone who's, familiar with that kind of mathematics, that kind of very fundamental algebra, it's like easy. You know how to solve the equation. Similarly, when it comes to fighting, when it comes to conflict, when it comes to positional awareness, the geometry of conflict, once you take the time to familiarize yourself with it, it's like, okay, I know exactly what to do. I know how to handle this. And I think, to be honest, the more you recognize those stimuli early on, the faster you can squash a situation before it becomes something that's truly, truly dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I've been harping so much on, there's so much wonderful workshops and information going out because of all of these hate crimes that people have been giving. And I encourage people to sign up for all of them, especially if they're free, right? Just go and see, because also there's no one size fits all. One workshop may really resonate with me and the other may be a more well-known, a more tested science. But if it doesn't resonate with me and I can't speak that language, or it doesn't work for me personally, then that's not for me. So that's what I try to explain to people. I hate the, which one's the best? I'm like, the best is the one that works for you, the one that you're going to practice and the one that you're actually going to do. Right. So there's no the best, right? The best is what you're actually going to say. So one of my things in the workshop is, arm yourself with even a phrase for verbal harassment that, you can say confidently that speaks to you. So I could give you this, scientifically proven phrase that's going to make someone go away or whatever. But if you don't naturally speak like that, it doesn't matter, right? So you have to find what works. And I don't know if you've ever read it. It's been a long time, but it's funny because I was reading this book and it's called When Violence is the Answer. Are you familiar? Anyway, but it kind of resonated with that whole, what you just said, which is expose yourself to the stimuli. So the book isn't like be violent. It's actually the opposite of that. It's not saying that you should be violent, but it's like when you're backed into the corner and someone's chased you down the alley, like there's something happens there, right? And so
was that Tim Larkin's book?
You know what? I'm going to look it up now because I cannot remember the name, but it's quite good. But it's just a very deceiving title because I think you're right. I think it's Tim Larkin. And it's a very deceiving title, but it's funny. I love telling people, yeah, I'm currently reading When Violence is the Answer. And they're like, of course you are. I'm like, no, it's actually more about the self-defense, right? It's more about avoiding and being familiar, being able to see and know what violence is and having familiarity, right? And so I just thought of that while you were speaking of all of that. And I'm like, I finished the book, but there's these training modules and I didn't finish them. And I'm thinking I should go back in and finish those up. But yeah.
Tim is a genius.
Yeah, you're right.
For your listeners who aren't familiar with Tim's work, Tim is one of the very few guys that I think truly adequately addresses asocial versus social violence. Mm-hmm. Like, I think a lot of people react when it's social violence, they react in a physical manner. Mm-hmm. When there's like a zillion chances to diffuse the situation. Mm-hmm. Now, what I'm talking about is this, like if someone comes up to you and mouths off, do you need to get in a stance and put your hands up like you're ready to fight? No. If they're mouthing off, if they're in your face, if they're just running their mouth, that's social violence. They're trying to have a social one-up on you. Mm-hmm. That does not demand a physical reaction unless they're physically like threatening you. If someone just pushes you once, it's your choice. Like a lot of people I know will say like, oh, well, they put their hands on me, so then they got to hit the floor. Yeah, that's your ego speaking there. Cute ego, but legally you're going to be boned.
Yes. Yes.
So Tim speaks a lot about that. And I think a lot of us would do better across the board, not just Asian Americans, but a lot of us as Americans around the world, never mind, not just Americans, would be good. It would be good for us to recognize when there's an asocial threat, like those guys that are just walking along, not even a word, and then, sucker punch someone.
Yeah.
Or shove an elderly person into a phone pole or into traffic. Yeah, these are asocial, violent predators because there's no warning.
Yeah,
there's no setup.
We're seeing with the hate crimes on the elderly right now, a lot of them.
Yes. But I think a lot of us who are younger, who are certainly stronger, and certainly those of us who are trained, need to be able to differentiate when someone is running their mouth and we can just whatever.
Yeah.
They're these are the kind of people that in their mindset, the only way to make their tree grow taller is to cut down everyone else. They've already lost. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because they're operating from that place of deficit. But we need to understand and be able to differentiate clearly and contextualize when someone is a definite physical threat and we need to act with urgency and with power and competence. And those other people can just whatever.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah. And that's a really big part of it as well, because the second part of that book is When Violence is the Answer, learning how to do what it takes when your life is at stake. Right. So it's very deceiving to just say when violence is the answer, but yeah, it's also something that people don't realize. When you learn a proper martial art, it helps teach you those instincts of not wanting to just be out looking for a fight and learning how to control those urges of a reaction off of somebody insulting you, right? People get insulted every day. People say bad, stupid things every day, and knowing that you're not going to like just have this gut reaction that's going to end in something violent where, you know, Oscar always likes to say, what's the worst that can happen? The worst can happen isn't necessarily you getting your butt kicked. The worst that can happen is you actually end up killing someone. And then what happened there? Like, do you end up going to jail? Does your family, what happens with your family? Like, there's a lot of things there that you think winning the quote unquote fight is a good scenario. That may not necessarily be the case. And I mean, obviously we want everyone to be safe. If your life is at stake, absolutely protect yourself at all costs. But I think there's this misunderstanding that martial arts leads to fighting, where actually, in my opinion, it actually helps you avoid fighting more than anything, because you learn so much along with that. So yeah, I'm glad you knew the name of course you knew the name of the author. You're so well read, but I was like, what is
and I'm actually
me right now.
I'm actually not that well read. I just happen to be, Tim is like a big brother to me, you know, like
you guys the same magazine, or like you,
I wrote a piece on him. I wrote a piece on him for Black Belt magazine, and he, you know, he was super, super hospitable. Like, he had me come out to one of his target focus training live trainings.
Yeah.
And I was shocked. Like, I'm thinking like, okay, you know, this is a guy that with an amazing list of creds.
Yes.
As far as the groups that he's worked with, as far as tactical operators, things like that, and different agencies and groups. And the entire weekend of immersive training was based on slow motion training. And so I was like, oh my God. He's like, you know, a lot of people try to go for hitting harder, hitting, you know, with more force, do this, do that, you know, and it's basically just getting wild. Whereas for him, his whole thing is like, you want to be precise, you want to be well targeted. So again, the moniker target focused training, like what are the high value targets? Identify the target, focus on those, penetrate, rotate, injure. And so I'm like, wow, this is great stuff, because instead of just swinging for the fences like a maniac, it's all about like, be methodical, be almost like mathematical in your approach. And then throughout the weekend, repeatedly throughout the weekend, he emphasized that social violence versus asocial violence. And I think that differentiation is clutch. And kids knew that. Like, it's something that I've been teaching my kids since they were like little, to understand like, when do you have to throw down, and when can you just like, meh, whatever. And so like, I think more of us as adults need to hear that. I would love to, honestly, like, you know, I don't say this lightly. I mean, I say this as someone who's been around a lot of different martial arts. Tim's presentation on social versus asocial violence, I would love to see as like required curriculum in every school in this nation.
Yeah, Oscar and I have talked about it. We're like, oh man, if he's ever in this area, we'd love to go to his workshop. And because I really enjoyed the book. Like I said, that's why I was like, listeners, no, it's not a violent book. It's like really, really good. But I'm glad we were able to talk about that and bring that up. And I think at the end of the day, we all have to check our egos. We all have to be accountable for our actions, and we all need to continuously learn and be open to learning. So we are going here. So we should probably wrap up. But Mark, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast again in such a short period of time and having this conversation with me. I think these are discussions that are truly important, and you sharing everything has been invaluable. So thank you.
It's always an honor to spend time with you like this.
All right. Until next time.
Looking forward to it.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.